Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 411 of the Juicebox Podcast. This episode is going to be rather unlike most, in that it's going to be incredibly utilitarian and not very funny. I know what you're thinking. Come on, Scott. The podcast is never funny. I hear you. But I try. The Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Gvoke HypoPen, the Omnipod tubeless insulin pump, the Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitor, the Contour Next to 1 blood glucose meter, Touched by Type 1, and of course I'm a big fan of the T1D exchange. Please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. This episode is the 411 for the Juicebox Podcast. I've been waiting 410 episodes to bring this to you. Sort of. Let me explain. As I record this in November of 2020, the show is approaching 3 million downloads, and 4 million is not far behind. It is charted on 40 charts in 2020. It consistently stays in the top 30 in its category. And there are very few countries in the world, actually there are very few places in the world where the show is not listened to. All of this to say that the podcast is doing much better than I could have anticipated. And as I sit here and think about it, I'm not sure that I could have planned better even if I had known that growth was going to be like this. What I'm talking about is that it's difficult sometimes for people to jump into an established podcast like this and know where to start. Multiple times every day I receive a message or there's a post in the private Facebook group for the podcast. Someone new has found the show and they're not certain where to begin. So I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out who the listeners are, what their needs and their intentions are. Some people just want to listen straight through. Those people are easy. Those of you who are looking for that completist feeling, go to the beginning and you catch up. Those people need to keep in mind that I've gotten much better at this as the years have passed. So I don't know how those early episodes compare with stuff now. But the bigger issue with someone who wants to begin at the start and work their way through is that they need to understand that's a journey and that every episode is going to build on itself. You're almost going to take the journey with me. And I guarantee you, I mean, I shouldn't guarantee, I'm not guaranteeing you, but it's my opinion, I should say. If you start at the beginning and listen straight through, when you're done, you will know how to keep your A1C in the 5s with very little effort. I believe that. I believe that that's what this podcast will bring you. But you have to remember, if you're going to listen straight through, that you won't even get to the first episode that people really speak about as being impactful to them until episode 11. Not that those first 10 aren't going to be helpful, but, going to get your real first zing in 11. So it's going to build slowly. You have to be in for a slow, steady burn that builds and builds and builds. And if you're a slow learner or you have plenty of time to listen, it's a completely reasonable way to start. But just remember, if you're showing up here because someone told you, listen to that podcast and your blood sugar is going to be better, it's not going to happen the first day. The first episode, you're going to listen to me interview some guy that was on American Idol 6 years ago who had diabetes. I don't know what's going to come from that. I haven't listened to that in a long time. So that's the patient approach. You could jump right into the pro tip episodes, but I wouldn't do that. I'd at least listen to the quick starts first. What I've been told over and over again is that the quick start episodes bring you, the listener, into my way of thinking about type 1 diabetes. And once you've kind of got that vibe, then the pro tip episodes make more sense. But what if you're completely newly diagnosed and you don't understand diabetes at all? Well, that's where the defining diabetes episodes come in. I found that newly diagnosed people are at a loss for what a lot of common terms around diabetes are. So I made these episodes called Defining Diabetes. The thing is, they're not all in one place. It's a podcast, right? Like there's some, here and there, and 10 episodes later, there's another one. So it can feel overwhelming to figure out where they all are. Here's what I've done for that. I've created a website for the podcast. Now you can go to juiceboxpodcast.com. Everything's there, including a link at the top to Diabetes Pro Tip, which, by the way, you can also get to by going to diabetesprotip.com. But when you get to the Diabetes Pro Tip link, it tells you a little bit about who I am, why I made the podcast. There's some reviews there from listeners, so you can kind of feel comfortable about it. And then all of the Diabetes Pro Tips are right there in a player you could actually listen to online, or at the very least, if you're in a podcast app, as I imagine most of you are, there's links there to podcast apps, and you can see the numbers that correspond with the different Diabetes Pro Tip episodes. Now, if you scroll down a little farther, the first thing you'll see are the latest episodes of the podcast, which you can kind of jump through, check out. Scroll a little farther, you get to the Defining Diabetes. It says Defining Diabetes, T1D terms clearly explained. And right now, as I record this, 408 is the most recent episode. But it goes all the way back. The first Defining Diabetes episode was at 236. So the pro tips begin at episode 210 and do not run concurrently. It's not like you can just go 211, 212, 213 and stick with the pro tips. It actually goes 210, 211, 212, then it jumps to 217, 218, 219, and then to 224. I tried to group them, but they also had to be spread out a little bit. I needed to give time because I had to give people time to listen. Now I'm in the middle of building a list for the Defining Diabetes episodes as well. And eventually when you get to this link, that list will be there. But you're also going to find episodes called Ask Scott and Jenny. And those are listener questions that are answered by me and Jenny Smith. Now, if you're new to the podcast, Jenny Smith has had type 1 diabetes, I believe, for 32 years. She's a certified diabetes educator. She's a licensed dietitian. She thinks about type 1 the way I do. So Jenny and I get along great. And we've been answering questions for people from this podcast on the podcast for years now, it feels like. So you think, okay, well, I hear what he's saying. I'll go listen to the pro tips, or I'll listen to the defining or whatever. I don't know how it's going to work best for you. You know yourself much better than I'm going to know you. If you want to begin with the quick starts, kind of get into my headspace, and then jump to the pro tips, that's cool. But if you think you need the definitions, I'd go Defining Diabetes, then quick starts, then the pro tips. It's my opinion. I know you think my opinion might count for something, but it doesn't. I learn differently than you do. I don't know how this is going to strike you. Here's the next thing. Whether you're a type 1 adult or a caregiver, this information is going to work for you. Adult or caregiver, it doesn't matter. Just because I'm the parent of a child with type 1 diabetes doesn't mean that this is a podcast only for parents. And again, go read the reviews. Scads and scads of adults living with type 1 listen to this show and speak to its benefits. Even type 1s who have had it for decades will find the show and say, wow, this changed my view of things. Anyway, the quick start episode list as it stands now begins at episode 4 with texting diabetes. It jumps to 11, bold with insulin, 29, fear of insulin, 37, Jenny Smith, diabetes guru, 44, getting off the diabetes roller coaster, 62, unfounded diabetes fear, 105, all about A1C, 121, insulin. And then episode 100 is me revisiting episode 11. So you get to hear me a number of years later, go back and listen to episode 11 and kind of give you what I've learned since then. Okay, now the Defining Diabetes episodes begin at 236, where we define bolus. 241, honeymoon. 243, A1C. 245, time and range. Now, I know what you're thinking, but if I know what honeymooning is, do I have to listen? These episodes are short and they're not dry. It's not just somebody reading a definition to you. There's some conversation around it. So I suggest listening to each of them, even if you think, oh, episode 247, standard deviation, I already know what that is. Just listen anyway. 249, extended bolus. 251, algorithm. 253, non-compliant. 255, glycemic index and glycemic load. 258, pre-bolus. 260, trust will happen. 269, low before high. 284, brittle diabetes. 286, stop the arrows. 288, ketones. 295, insulin resistance and overbolusing. 344, see that? That's a big jump there. Feeding insulin. This is why they can be more difficult to find right in your podcast player, especially for some of you who, by the way, maybe you're listening right now going, I've never listened to a podcast before. This is my first time trying. I understand, but don't worry. It's just an app on your phone. Everyone has one. They don't have to cost you anything. iPhone users, your phone comes with an app called Podcasts. You can listen on Apple Music, Spotify, Amazon Music, Pandora. You can actually ask Alexa. You can ask Siri to play the Juicebox podcast. There are a bazillion ways for you to listen. Never should they cost you any money. Please keep in mind, a podcast app does not need to cost anything. Now, if you have some like super terrific one that you love and you pay a little bit for it, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just telling you, you should never find yourself paying for this podcast. It is absolutely free to listen to. Always. Player FM, Deezer. In India, Ghana. Like I said, Apple Music, Pandora, Radio.com, Amazon Alexa, Spotify, iHeartRadio. You can listen right at juiceboxpodcast.com if you want, or on your Apple phone with the Apple Podcast app. There are a bazillion ways to listen. Okay? So that shouldn't be trouble. If you have trouble, send me a message. I'll help you. Okay, back to the defining diabetes. I got off on a little tangent there. 347, bump and nudge. 352, rage bolus. Now, you may notice that some of these things you've heard before. Like, Scott, I've heard of bolus, but I haven't heard of bump and nudge. Some of these are definitions from how I talk about diabetes, and some of them are more global definitions about type 1. Episode 358, compression lows and interstitial fluid. Episode 360, fat and protein rise. Episode 378, dawn phenomenon. 379, the smoggy effect. 380, feet on the floor. 408, insulin sensitivity factor. And by the time you listen to this, there very well may be more. The Ask Scott and Jenny's start back at episode 262. And I believe there are, I'm looking for you, 14 episodes of Ask Scott and Jenny's at this point, with many more to come. Now, here's the other thing. You might be thinking, oh, this podcast is Scott and Jenny. Interestingly, Jenny is only on the episodes that are very specific to management. So when you hear me interview someone, whether it be a famous person with type 1 diabetes or a listener or just anyone who has type 1, that's just going to be me and the person who's being interviewed. Every once in a while, I interview Jenny for fun. But Jenny's there for the management stuff. She's sort of my more medical side of the kind of blue collar way I talk about type 1 diabetes. Okay, so you're 13 minutes into this. That's good. You haven't stopped listening yet. But at this point, it's probably beginning to feel a little overwhelming. I understand. But don't worry, it won't be. None of these episodes are medicinal. They won't feel like you're in school. I promise. They're lighthearted and fun. They're informative, and I take pride in how easy they are to understand and put into practice. It's worth your time. My daughter is 16 years old. She has had type 1 diabetes since she was 2 years old. For the last 6, it's got to be almost 7 years now, I've had her A1C between 5.2 and 6.2. And honestly, in the last 5 years, it's been between 5.2 and 6. With 0 diet restrictions. She is now 16 years old. She's a woman. She has hormonal fluctuations. We do not limit her diet. And these are our results. Very stable, steady blood sugars that all come from what you're going to hear on this podcast. I don't do anything in my home life. My daughter doesn't do anything in her private life that is not reflected here in the podcast. I promise you, find the time to listen. It will change your life. And after an adjustment period that should not be too long, you will not find yourself thinking about type 1 diabetes very often. I almost never think about type 1, but those are our results. It's doable, and I think I'm pretty good at explaining how we handle things here. Hopefully something we do here will help you as well. You don't need to take all of it. You can take little bits of it, the parts that work for you. It doesn't matter to me. I'm just sharing. I hope it helps you. The last couple things I'd like to say. One, I didn't realize when I started the podcast that it would become what it has been. I didn't realize that people always wouldn't be along for the journey, that people would show up in 2020 who had just heard about the podcast. There are people in the Facebook group. So there's a private Facebook group for this podcast. It's called Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes. There's also a public group called Bold with Insulin. But speaking specifically about the private group, it's made up of people who, when they got there, never heard of the podcast. Because so many listeners of this show ended up congregating in this Facebook group and talking about management and diabetes and whatnot, that it actually became one of the more popular type 1 diabetes Facebook groups that are on Facebook. So now imagine I made a podcast. I think everybody is coming for the podcast, but now the Facebook group has gotten so popular that people are showing up in the group thinking, oh, I've heard about this group that helps people. And they get in there and then they're like, hey, tell me how you did this. And people are like, yeah, we listened to the podcast. And the new people sometimes say, what podcast? Which is freaking me out. I never expected there'd be another pathway to the information. Really a pleasant surprise. But anyway, if you're listening to this, go join the Facebook group. Those people are crazy good. And as a matter of fact, this short episode is really nothing more than the answers that I've seen other people give fellow listeners when they say, where should I begin? Now, here's the other thing. There's probably fewer than 100 episodes that are really about management stuff. But meanwhile, there are 411 at this moment episodes of the show. And you might be thinking, well, I don't need the other stuff. I'm here for management ideas. Fair enough. But there are a ton of management ideas inside of the interviews. People come on all the time and say something I'd never thought of before. Or in the course of conversation, I'll come up with a new way of saying something that I find, I'm like, wow, this is I can't believe this just occurred to me now. How come I haven't thought of this for years, right? So if you're thinking you're just the community person, I'm just here for community, which a lot of people are. They're just here to listen to other people who have type 1 diabetes talk about their experiences. I still think the management stuff would be really valuable for you. And if you think you're just here for the management stuff, I genuinely believe that the conversational stuff will do a lot towards building that management. I think the podcast is a pretty well-conceived full circle experience. And it's a living document because as it grows, my understanding of diabetes grows along with it. Sometimes I come up with new ideas or different ways that to handle things. And after I've done them here at home, for a very long time, I don't just ever think of something and blurt it out on the podcast. But after I have proof, after doing something over and over again, it will start to come out in the show. So I know what you're thinking, or at least I hope you're thinking, wow, I'm going to try this because I really want for you to have a long, healthy, comfortable life. Everything you want to do with type 1 diabetes is doable. I know you think, oh, if I get real active, my blood sugar is going to crash, but that's not necessarily true. But I know people think that. I know that people think, well, if I eat something, my blood sugar is going to just shoot up and stay up for hours. And maybe it'll come back down and maybe it won't. But that doesn't have to be true either. So many things that you think about type 1 diabetes don't have to be your reality. And there's nothing special, nothing magical. This whole podcast is about understanding how to use insulin. And once you do that, I'm hard pressed to think of something my daughter can't eat that I can't stop from being a spike and stop from having a low later. And those episodes I've been telling you about, Defining Diabetes, Ask Scott and Jenny, the Quick Start episodes, and the diabetes pro tip episodes. They'll all lead you to those ideas. It really, really is doable. Things really can be so much better than they are right now. I want that for you. And here's the last thing. This show is ad supported. I'm never going to ask you for money. I'm never going to ask you to buy my booklet. I'm never going to say, send me some cash. Nothing like that. Never. Okay. The podcast is free for you. It is supported by ads. It is a full-time job for me, but I'm supported by ads. So as long as you're supportive of the show will continue on forever and ever, just as it is. I don't think that understanding how to keep your blood sugar stable should cost you $1. You shouldn't have to pay somebody $50 a month to get their thoughts in little bits and pieces. You shouldn't have to buy some bullshit PDF that explains everything to you. Everything you need is in this podcast. It is 100% free, and it comes right from my heart. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, like I said, reach out through Instagram. I'm at Juicebox Podcast. Reach out through Facebook, Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes, or Bold with Insulin, depending on if you want to be a member of the private or public group. And that's it. Start listening. Be bold. Have great results. Oh, and subscribe in your podcast player, no matter what podcast player you use. I just opened up the Apple one a minute ago while I was talking. I went right into search and I searched defining diabetes and scrolled down, and every defining diabetes episode popped up. Let me see what happens if I put in diabetes pro tip. The show pops up first. You scroll past it to episodes and they're all there. Oh, that's pretty easy. Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's been valuable to you. Welcome to the show if you're new. And if you've been here for a while and you're just getting a refresher, I really appreciate your support. The Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by the Omnipod tubeless insulin pump. And you can get a free, no-obligation demo of that tubeless insulin pump by going to myomnipod.com/juicebox. Want to learn more about the Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitor? Dexcom.com/juicebox. Check out touchedbytype1.org to find my favorite diabetes organization. Touched by Type 1 is at touchedbytype1.org. They're also on Facebook and Instagram. Of course, you can get the Contour Next One blood glucose meter at contournext.com/juicebox. Absolutely the best, most accurate blood glucose meter my daughter has ever used. And you can find out more about Gvoke HypoPen. That's the glucagon my daughter carries at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. And if you're from the United States and would like to support type 1 diabetes research, please check out t1dexchange.org/juicebox. Support the sponsors, support the show. All the content that we spoke about here is in the announcement section of the private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes. There you'll find a note from me, different ways to listen to the show, those quick start episodes, the pro tip series, and links to a ton of different podcast players. There's also this great thread where people leave messages for new listeners so that you'll understand why they enjoy the podcast. Like this one from Kat. This podcast has been life-changing for me and my family. My oldest son and I were both experiencing severe diabetes burnout when my toddler was diagnosed with diabetes as well. I was lost and struggling on how to cope and how to regain control of what felt like an uncontrollable situation. A year later, my oldest has gone from an 11 A1C to a 5.7, and my toddler from a 9 to a 5.2. More than that, my family is happy. My oldest is excelling at school and feels better than he has in a long time. I will forever be grateful, a fan and an avid listener to this podcast. I truly appreciate all of the hard work Scott puts into the show, this group, and his social media. If it wasn't for the Juicebox Podcast, I honestly can't picture how things would be for my family. Kristen said, the podcast is a community, a way to think about insulin, a window into parts of life you aren't experiencing, access to ideas you may not have on your own. It's perfection. Catherine said, I almost didn't tune in when I first stumbled upon Juicebox, thinking it would be mostly about kids, which I don't have, and I'm way past that stage of life. But Juicebox has been an incredibly valuable resource of practical info and real-life experiences. Scott has given me new understanding and ways to think about diabetes, and I am gaining confidence in using insulin, all the stuff I did not get from my endo or even my CDE. I find myself listening to the Juicebox podcast more than once, especially the pro tip and defining diabetes episodes. And that's an all-time first for me, so thank you, and please keep it coming. Last one's from Alan. It seems like yesterday, but a little over 2 years ago, my wife and I started listening to the podcast. Well, mostly me, because I was living in a world of fear. My wife had been around diabetes almost her entire life and was trained to just accept it. But we had the opportunity to hear Scott give his Bold with Insulin talk at our support group. And my wife was there thinking, this guy is full of shit. But after the talk, her and I discussed Scott's presentation along with revisiting episode 29, Fear of Insulin. With a few tears on the couch between the two of us, this switch went off, and that nervous feeling of fear and being overwhelmed turned into a team of bumping and nudging warriors. Not every day was a smooth ride, and we made a ton of errors along the way, but they became lessons. Each podcast episode in its own way always has something we can take from it. Stories of families struggling to have great success assure you that it is possible. And now having a group of like-minded people to discuss issues and questions with is fantastic. The Juicebox Podcast is available 100% free everywhere you get your audio.